Okay, you've brought us some incredible source material today, a lecture transcript from a leading expert, and we're going to dive deep into a corner of art history that's, well, surprisingly complex and absolutely fascinating. The birth and development of still life painting right there in Rome.
It really is. And it's a field where our historians, they really earn their keep. You have this explosion of amazing artwork, but often the simple things you take for granted, like who painted it or exactly when, are incredibly hard to pin down.
The records are just
Silent
sometimes.
Frustratingly silent, yeah.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to follow the threads laid out in this lecture, try to untangle some of those mysteries, and really understand what makes Roman still life, particularly its surprising origins, so unique. And as the source material makes clear, you absolutely have to start with one figure.
Michelangelo Merisi, known as Caravaggio.
Yeah.
He's the seismic event in this story. Born near Milan, probably late 1571 or maybe early 1572. His father was an architect. We know he spent his youth in Lombardy, possibly studied with Simone Pietrosano, and he later claimed, interestingly, to be a student of Titian, which would link him to that powerful Venetian tradition.
But here's the first big mystery this lecture highlights. We know nothing about any work he did before he got to Rome. Zip. Nada.
It's baffling, isn't it? He leaves Milan around, 18 years old, heading south, but where exactly? Venice, Florence, there's just no concrete proof. And the specific date he actually arrived in Rome was, for a long time, another major puzzle. The sort of long-standing consensus, influenced by figures like Roberto Longhi, placed him there in 1592 or 1593.
And that was the accepted timeline for decades, right?
Right up until quite recently, actually. That's where the diligent work mentioned in the lecture comes in researchers digging through Roman church parish censuses, these incredibly detailed records of who lived where.
Wow.
And they found his first recorded address in Rome, the date, 1596.
Okay, let's pause on that for a second. I mean, what difference does 3 or 4 years make in the grand scheme of art history? Is it really that big a deal?
Oh, it's huge. Think about it. Caravaggio gets his first major public commission, the Contarelli Chapel, in late 1599. If he arrived in 1592, he had roughly 7 years to produce that substantial body of famous early works we attribute to him.
Right.
But if he arrived in 1596, he only had 3 years. Just 3.
So art historians suddenly had to kind of squeeze all those key early paintings, the Bacchus, the boy with a basket of fruit, all those into a much, much tighter window.
Precisely. It completely changes the timeline for understanding his stylistic development, his early career output, everything.
Okay.
And this challenge is made even tougher by another fundamental problem the lecture points out. Caravaggio almost never signed or dated his easel paintings.
Really? Never?
Well, very rarely. We only get reliable dates from the official church commissions where, execution dates were recorded in archives, that sort of thing.
And speaking of things we don't have from him, 0 known drawings. Not a single one.
Which, as the lecture explains, is absolutely extraordinary in the context of Italian art. I mean, drawing was the foundation. Leonardo called it the heart of art. It was how artists studied, how they planned compositions, how they captured ideas.
It was their language, basically.
Exactly, their visual language, especially strong in central Italy, like Florence and Rome. Now, his Lombard background might offer a partial explanation. Perhaps that tradition was less focused on drawing than, say, Florence. But to have no surviving drawings at all, it's a major puzzle, still is.
So he arrives in Rome whenever that was exactly needs to eat. The lecture says he started by painting heads, just heads.
Yes, simple figure studies, apparently. He reportedly sold these through an antiquarian when he was just starting out, to make some money. But very quickly, in this early Roman period, still life elements begin appearing in his work. And not just as background filler, they start taking on real significance.
Like in paintings such as The Boy Peeling Fruit.
Right. That's often considered one of the earliest surviving works we know of, though maybe not the absolute first thing he ever painted in Rome. Even here, though, there's uncertainty. What fruit is it exactly? An apple? A peach? Something else. It's hard to tell. And then you factor in there are maybe 10 or 12 versions out there, most likely copies, not all originals. But the key point the lecture makes is the focus isn't on perfect botanical realism like you might see with some northern artists. The figure is still the main event, you see, with the still life as an important accessory.
Then there's the intriguing sick Bacchus. That one feels different.
It does. Many see this as a self-portrait from a difficult patch in his life. He'd left Cavalier d'Arpino's workshop, was reportedly unwell.
Right.
The lecture suggests his pale complexion, the slightly wilted look, maybe even the rather meager, unripe fruit arrangement. Those peaches aren't quite ready, the grapes are a bit sparse, maybe reflect his physical state. It's an early exploration of that theme that becomes so central later, the relationship between man and objects.
And this relationship gets really dynamic, doesn't it, in The Boy with a Basket of Fruit?
Oh, absolutely. This painting is pivotal. That basket of fruit isn't just in the scene, it's practically a star player. It really shows his exploration of movement, of interaction.
Yeah.
The lecture describes the still life here almost acting as a mediator, an intermediary that pulls your eye in before you even fully register the boy holding it. It comes forward.
That sense of dynamic interaction with the still life culminates, perhaps, in the famous lizard-bitten boy.
Ah, yes. This painting is just a masterclass in capturing a precise, fleeting moment. The boy is reacting shock, pain, maybe, to something seemingly coming from the fruit or flowers, traditionally identified as a lizard.
Even if, as the lecture points out, maybe lizards don't actually bite quite like that.
Exactly. The naming is traditional, lucertola in Italian. But what's brilliant here is the artistic solution, how he creates this frozen, dynamic pose, like hitting pause on a video, right? And it's all triggered by the still life elements. The impulse for the figure's dramatic movement originates there, in the objects.
And technically, he's experimenting, too, with the glass vase.
Definitely. Look closely at that glass vase. The way the light passes through it, the refractions, it links back to centuries of interest in optical studies and art, going right back to Leonardo, even earlier.
Wow.
The lecture mentions there are two main versions, one at the Longhi Foundation in Florence, one in London's National Gallery. The lecturer in the source material favors the Longhi version, sees more spontaneity and energy there, but it's debated.
Okay, so from these early works where still life is integrated, often dramatically, we arrive at the painting that stands alone. The single, pure still life by Caravaggio that we know of. The iconic basket of fruit.
This is it. It's almost shocking when you think about it, isn't it? That out of his entire known oeuvre, only this one canvas is dedicated solely to inanimate objects.
And again, no signature, no date.
Nope. Art historians generally place it around 1599, right about the time or just before he got his big break with the Contarelli Chapel Commission.
And it was acquired very early on by Cardinal Del Monte, who was a really key patron for him.
Yes, absolutely. Now, look at the composition. This is where it gets really interesting, and the lecture spends some time on this. There's no table depicted. The basket is perched, seemingly just hanging there, over a simple horizontal band of color.
Right, it just floats almost.
It does, and this creates a powerful illusion, a trompe l'oeil. The basket bulges out towards us, into the viewer's space. It creates this almost tactile sensation. You feel like you could reach out and touch those fruits.
It looks so incredibly natural, like he just grabbed a basket from the market, set it down, and painted it that afternoon.
And yet, the lecture argues really strongly against that very idea. It's not a casual snapshot. It's presented as a meticulously constructed formula. There's nothing left to chance here. It's a law of art, if you will, created to look as real as possible, absolutely, but born from an intellectual concept, not just simple observation of one specific basket at one moment.
And the proof of that intellectual concept is in the mix of fruit itself.
That's the crucial piece of evidence. Yeah. You've got figs, an apple, a quince, a peach, a pear, grapes. These aren't all ripe at the same time of year. They represent different seasons, all brought together artificially in one basket. This confirms he wasn't painting a single basket of fresh fruit from a single sitting. It was an idea, a constructed reality, carefully selected.
And he deliberately includes signs of decay, doesn't he?
Yes, look closely. The spots on the apple and pear, that slightly withered leaf. This detail strongly connects the painting to the Vanitas theme, which was absolutely pervasive in the culture and art of the time.
The meaning?
Meaning it's about the fleeting nature of earthly beauty, the inevitability of decay, the brevity of life. All these beautiful things will pass. The lecturer quotes that wonderful phrase, calling the apple the most beautiful spoiled apple in the history of art.
I love that, and the source specifically contrasts this Vanitas view with Roberto Longhi's earlier, perhaps simpler interpretation of it being just, a piece of life.
Right. Longhi, writing back in the mid-20th century, really emphasized the raw naturalism, the slice of life aspect. But the lecture pushes back, arguing it's far more complex, a carefully crafted formula based on the truth of life, yes, absolutely. But elevated beyond a mere snapshot. It's full of meaning, deliberate meaning.
Okay.
And while other interpretations do exist, maybe connections to the resurrection of Christ, for example, the Vanitas link is probably the most widely accepted because it fits so well with the cultural context of Counter-Reformation Rome.
This fundamental point about meaning and construction leads us to a key distinction the lecture makes: the difference between Italian still life and Northern European still life.
This is vital for understanding the whole genre in Italy, especially its beginnings. Italian still life, particularly starting with Caravaggio here, is fundamentally not about just imitating everyday life or trying to immerse you in a detailed domestic interior.
Which is more what you see in Dutch or Flemish painting.
Exactly. Northern still life often revels in depicting the textures and objects of daily living, the cluttered table, the kitchen scene. It aims for that feeling of everyday presence.
You don't see a kitchen table or a dining room setting in Caravaggio's basket. It's sort of nowhere specific.
Precisely. The space is often abstract, just that simple band. The lecture traces this back to the ancient tradition of verisimilitude and illusionism in art, the idea, going back to those famous stories like Pliny the Elder's about Zeuxis and Parrhasius competing.
The ones about painting grapes, so real birds tried to eat them.
That's the one. The idea that art's power lay in its ability to deceive the eye, to create a convincing illusion of reality. But in Italy, especially in the Renaissance and Baroque, this wasn't just about simple imitation. It was a display of artistic mastery, bravura, making paint look like reality, not just copying it. It had an intellectual dimension.
How does it compare to Spanish still life? Thinking of artists like Sanchez Cotán or Zurbarán, they feel different again.
Oh, that's another world entirely, as the lecture describes it. Spanish still life can feel much harsher, starker, almost surreal sometimes. It's often set in a kind of vacuum, a dark, empty space. Often features dead objects like game birds.
Yeah.
The light can be incredibly intense, almost seeming to strip form away, very dramatic. And there's often no sense of a human presence or context for these objects.
So different from the Italian approach.
Completely different. In Italian still life, even when there's no figure present, the object itself, like Caravaggio's basket, seems imbued with a certain dignity. It almost takes on the role previously held by man in the humanist tradition. It has presence.
Mm-hmm.
Spanish still life generally doesn't grant that same elevated status. The objects are often stark, isolated, intensely observed, but somehow separate.
Okay, let's circle back to Caravaggio then. After this singular pure still life, the basket of fruit, do we see that motif, that basket, reappear in his later work?
Yes, absolutely. And it's used with incredible dramatic effect. Look at the first version of the Supper at Emmaus, the one in London from the early 1600s. The basket is right there on the very edge of the table, leaning out precariously, almost tipping into our space. It pulls the viewer right into the scene, doesn't it?
It really does. It adds tension.
Exactly. The still life elements, including those damaged apples again, they contribute directly to the dramaturgy of the painting, heightening the shock and revelation of the human interaction.
But this changes in the later Milan version of the Supper at Emmaus, the one from 1606.
It does, yeah. By this point, Caravaggio's life was very different. He was on the run after killing a man about to flee Rome. The still life is present in the Milan version, but it's pushed back onto the table, it's less prominent, it doesn't project out into the viewer's space in the same way.
His focus shifted.
It seems so. His focus had clearly shifted even more intensely to the psychological and religious drama of his figures. The lecture suggests still life as a genre for its own sake. That intense focus on the object was perhaps no longer his primary interest by then. He was painting these big, dark, human dramas.
And there's that quote attributed to him, supposedly by his contemporary Marini, that painting objects took just as much effort, just as much skill as painting figures.
Yes, tanta manifattura, so much workmanship. It certainly suggests he recognized the technical and intellectual challenge involved in depicting reality convincingly, whether it was fruit or flesh, even if his true passion, especially later, lay with the human figure and its dramas.
Let's zoom out again for a moment and look at Rome around the time Caravaggio arrived. Who else was painting still life elements or things close to it? Was he inventing this out of thin air?
Not entirely out of thin air. A major figure at the time was Cavaliere d'Arpino, Giuseppe Cesare. Caravaggio actually worked briefly in his workshop. D'Arpino was part of a tradition, a very established one, of painting garlands of fruit and foliage, often in fresco decoration.
Like decorative borders and things.
Exactly. A practice revived in the Renaissance by Raphael, looking back to antiquity. D'Arpino's large workshop was significant.
And the lecture mentions he had specialists, people just painting fruit and flowers.
Yes, that's right. His workshop employed artists who specialized only in flowers and fruits. We saw examples in the source of Dorpino's own attempts at still life panels, like some bird pieces. These works, sometimes compositionally a bit odd maybe, might have been samples from the workshop repertory showing what they could do.
So these represent earlier forms of Roman still life, kind of predating Caravaggio's big impact.
Exactly. Late 15th, early 16th century. There was even a moment, the lecture notes, when one of these Dorpino workshop pieces was debated as a possible early Caravaggio, but that idea has generally been discounted now.
Which just brings us right back to the ongoing challenge of attribution in this period, doesn't it?
It's absolutely central to studying still life. There's a whole group of paintings, early 17th century still lifes, that were debated as possible Caravaggios for quite a while because stylistically they looked similar, the strong light, the way objects were depicted.
Right.
These are now conventionally attributed to someone called the Master of Hartford, named after a key painting in a museum in Hartford, Connecticut.
But the lecture's view on this Master of Hartford seemed a bit skeptical. Not quite convinced they're on Caravaggio's level.
Yes, the lecture views these less as direct Caravaggios and more likely as works by an arc-using master, someone looking back, or perhaps a skilled imitator, suggesting they might not quite reach Caravaggio's quality or innovation. It just highlights how attribution isn't always settled history. It's often an ongoing debate based on close-looking stylistic analysis and finding new evidence.
And there was another anonymous group mentioned too, the Master of the Aquavella Still Life.
Right, named after an antiquarian dealer. Some links have been suggested, maybe to Carlo Saraceni, another Caravaggisti. But again, the lecturer voiced some doubts, particularly about whether some of these were even Italian. Pointing to details like specific types of tablecloths or the inclusion of a painted fly motif seen as perhaps less typical for Italy at that exact moment, possibly suggesting northern artists working in Rome or even later imitations. These anonymous groups really underscore how many significant works are out there without clear artists attached. It makes the art historical study incredibly challenging, but also exciting when connections are made.
So after Caravaggio leaves Rome, presumably under a cloud, how did still life evolve among the artists influenced by him, the so-called Caravaggisti?
Well, it's interesting because the lecture notes, Caravaggio himself reportedly didn't have formal pupils in the traditional sense and apparently disliked being imitated too closely. His influence was more indirect, absorbed by others.
Like Bartolomeo Manfredi, wasn't he maybe Caravaggio's servant?
Possibly. There's a Manfredi mentioned in some legal documents involving Caravaggio. He stayed in Rome and became a successful painter in the Caravaggesque style, but the source suggests he reportedly wasn't particularly interested in painting still life objects himself. His focus was figures.
And Cecco del Caravaggio, another follower.
Cecco is a fascinating, slightly mysterious figure. He's an example of a follower who did incorporate still life prominently with figures, but his approach was quite different from the masters.
How so?
In Cecco's paintings, the objects, musical instruments, food, whatever, can sometimes feel so detailed and prominent that they almost overwhelm the figure. It pushes the painting toward genre scenes, everyday life scenes, and maybe disrupts that perfect, tense balance between figure and object that Caravaggio achieved in his best early works.
So when did pure still life, paintings only of objects, really solidify as its own distinct genre in Rome, after Caravaggio had sort of shown the potential?
Definitely in the early Baroque period, in the decades after Caravaggio had made such an impact. Art historians like, again, Roberto Longhi, writing later, identified key figures from this next generation, artists like Bonn, Cellini, and that debated Master of Hartford as being central to the development of independent still life painting as a respected genre in the city.
And the challenges with attribution. Did they get any easier as time went on?
Not significantly for many of these artists, unfortunately. A huge number of works still remain unsigned and undated, often locked away in private collections for centuries, which makes systematic study very, very difficult.
But still life was becoming more accepted.
Oh, yes. It was becoming a recognized academic pursuit. The lecture mentions Pietro Bellori's Academy in Rome, located in Palazzo Rescian. It was a school where young artists were explicitly taught to paint from nature, including still life subjects. So it was definitely becoming an accepted part of artistic training, not just a minor decorative thing.
Okay, so who are some of the key masters from this post-Caravaggio wave that the lecture highlights?
Well, there's Pier Paolo Bonzi, known as Bon, who is associated with Bellori's Academy. The source showed a signed still life by him, which is helpful.
Always nice to have a signature.
Absolutely. His style often places objects on stone steps or ledges, rather than domestic tables. The space is often undefined, quite abstract, usually with a dark background. You can see how that continues some of those ideas about presentation and space we saw in Caravaggio's Basket of Fruit.
And then there's Tommaso Cellini, who the lecturer called their personal hero. Why him?
Cellini is presented as a particularly important figure and clearly a focus of the lecture's author's own research, which is fascinating. A key moment discussed is the attribution of the boy with a fiasco painting that's a boy holding a wicker flask. It's now in Madrid, but for a long time it was thought to be by a completely different artist, Guido Cagnacci.
And the lecturer figured out it was Cellini.
How? By looking very closely at the style, Cellini's style is described as more dramatic, maybe less refined than Caravaggio. He seems to need specific textures, like broken wicker in the flask, strong spiral movements in the composition, a very specific kind of directional lighting, almost like moonlight, the lecture suggests, and maybe a less unifying contour around the forms compared to Caravaggio. By comparing these features to other potential Cellini works, they built the case.
And that attribution is now widely accepted by scholars.
Largely, yes. The Cagnacci attribution has been mostly abandoned for that picture. It's a great example of how careful stylistic analysis and, frankly, art historical detective work can reshape attributions that were held for a very long time. The lecturer also mentioned identifying another Cellini still life, one with a basket, though not shown in the source, pointing to consistent details like the way he paints drops of water or his preference for rough stone surfaces rather than polished tables.
Let's talk about Michelangelo Sirquazzi next. He sounds like a really versatile artist.
He really was. Known by multiple nicknames, which tells you something. Delia Battagli, because he painted battle scenes. And he was also linked to the Bamboccianti, those artists who painted small, often low-life genre figures. So he was trained in figures, but clearly also a master of still life. But again, attributing those still lifes specifically to him was tricky without signatures.
So how did art historians figure out which still lifes were actually his?
The lecture credits the art historian Giuliano Briganti with a breakthrough. Apparently, Briganti managed to link specific figures that appeared in certain still-life paintings to figures in Sirquazzi's known figure paintings. That allowed a core group of Sirquazzi's still lifes to be identified with more confidence.
Clever. And what was his big innovation for Roman still life, according to the lecture?
He took it outdoors. Instead of the abstract spaces or implied interiors, his still lifes are often set explicitly in the open air, sometimes by the sea, or on rocks within natural landscapes.
Oh, interesting.
The Rotterdam painting mentioned, with the young man and woman gathering fruit or grapes, or the one in the Ostankino collection in Russia, are examples. The lecture also points out a recurring detail in some works attributed to him, a bamboo stick often seen in the foreground. Just a little detail, but it might suggest he shared or influenced other artists with this motif, possibly including Campidoglio, who comes later.
A giant in the field of flower painting is next on the list. Mario Nuzzi.
Ah, yes, Mario Nuzzi, known universally as Mario dei Fiori, Mario of the Flowers. He is presented in the lecture as an absolute genius, a major master of Roman Baroque still life, specializing almost purely in flowers.
And his fame was immense. The lecture mentioned a street named after him.
Yes, Via Mario de' Fiori, right near the Spanish Steps in Rome, named after him during his lifetime. That is truly extraordinary for any painter back then, let alone one specializing in still life, which wasn't always seen as the highest genre.
That really speaks volumes.
It really does. And here's a crucial point the lecture highlights, connecting him back. A direct link, recently confirmed by documents like parish records found in archives, connects Nuzzi back to the earlier Caravaggism still life tradition. He was the nephew and, importantly, the pupil of Tommaso Cellini.
The lecturer's hero.
The very same. Nuzzi lived and worked with his uncle Cellini. This shows a clear lineage, how that still life impulse flowed from those earlier artists right into the full Baroque flower painting.
Still no signed or dated works from Nuzzi, though.
Yeah.
The eternal problem.
Seems so, no. But his life dates are known. And we do have documented works, like 4 large allegories of the seasons painted for the powerful Chigi family. In those, Nuzzi painted the incredibly detailed flowers alongside figures painted by other artists. He really established the formula, the lecture argues, for the grand Italian Baroque flower still life, often building the composition from the bottom up, maybe echoing Caravaggio's basket, with the vase low and the flowers rising dramatically, dynamically.
Was he influenced by northern painters like Jan Bruegel, who were obviously masters of flower painting?
Oh, definitely. He would have seen their work. But the point made is that he adapted those influences, creating a distinctly Italian approach. He wasn't just copying, he reportedly loved and grew flowers himself, painted from nature, absolutely, but used that knowledge to create these magnificent compositions filled with atmosphere, light, and depth.
Not just pretty bouquets.
Exactly. The lecture notes that later Italian flower paintings sometimes became more simply decorative, maybe losing some of Nuzi's complexity and force. The Prague painting mentioned, with the dramatically tipped vase and the shimmering blue satin fabric, is offered as an example of his sophistication, his almost elusive quality.
And he also painted garlands and on mirrors.
Yes, he painted garlands, continuing that tradition, and he was a major artist creating decorative paintings on mirrors, which was a popular form of lavish interior design then. Huge mirrors would be partially painted over with flowers and motifs. He was apparently a big rival of Paolo Porpora in that specific area.
Okay, so let's talk about Paolo Porpora then.
Right. Porpora was originally a Neapolitan artist, but he came to Rome, a contemporary and, as mentioned, a rival of Mario Nuzzi. The lecture contrasts his style, maybe less refined, less elegant than Nuzzi, but perhaps more focused on the raw force of nature, the sheer vitality of things. He often used larger forms, more dramatic, sometimes quite stark light.
And he also painted on mirrors in Rome, competing with Nuzzi.
Yes, like those famous examples in the Gallery Colonna in Rome, they were definitely in direct competition for commissions.
And the mushroom still life is highlighted as one of his masterpieces.
Absolutely. The one featured in the exhibition discussed in the source is seen as particularly fine, a real powerhouse of a painting. It's compared to a similar, also excellent piece in the Louvre. Porpora was also known for other types of still life, including ones with birds and animals, herons, owls, frogs, and was praised for his incredibly realistic depiction of things like rocks and pebbles. Very tactile.
Next, the lecture introduces us to the carpet masters, starting with Francesco Maltese.
Yes, Francesco Maltese. And here's one of the great modern detective stories of this field. His real name, Francesco Fioravino, was apparently only discovered relatively recently in 2005.
No way. How?
Through a portrait found in archives in Malta identifying him. So he was indeed from Malta, which explains his common nickname, Maltese. His time in Rome was actually quite short, the lecture notes, maybe arriving around 1647 and dying in 1654. But he clearly made an impact, had aristocratic Roman patrons, and even joined the prestigious Order of Malta shortly before he died.
And his signature subject was these large, expensive carpets.
Exactly. Often described as Turkish, but more accurately Persian carpets, these were incredibly luxurious items at the time. Maltese specialized in painting them draped over surfaces, often with other objects like clocks, armor, or fruit. He painted them with stunning illusionism, really capturing the texture and pile of the fabric.
The lecture emphasizes this wasn't just depicting a normal domestic scene.
Right. It was a deliberate artistic choice, a display of luxury, perhaps influenced by the patronage system in Italy, where artists often painted specific works for specific wealthy clients, unlike the more open market system developing in the north. It was about showcasing splendor.
And the Hermitage painting attributed to him the one that was even acquired as a Rembrandt at one point. That sounds incredible.
Incredible, isn't it? It really speaks to the quality and the visual richness of his work. The lecture calls it one of his best, noting its elegance, a certain restraint despite the richness, and particularly the magical quality of the light on the sugar-coated fruits he sometimes included, making them appear almost translucent.
And Antonio Giannizzari carried on this carpet tradition after Maltese.
Yes, referred to as Aldini in the lecture transcript, possibly just the lecture's pronunciation or a known variation. Giannizzari was about 20 years younger than Maltese and definitely continued painting these elaborate still lifes featuring carpets.
Okay.
And the lecturer makes another interesting attribution point here, identifying a second Hermitage painting, one also acquired long ago as a Maltese, as actually being by Giannizzari. They specifically suggest comparing the two paintings side by side if you ever get the chance.
To see the difference.
Exactly. Look at the difference in how the carpets are folded, how the light hits the surfaces, how the forms are rendered. Giannizzari's style is seen as maybe less dramatic, perhaps a bit more decorative, but featuring similar elements like those distinctive sugar-coated fruits and often silver vases displayed on the carpets. It really underscores the subtle stylistic differences and the ongoing challenges of attribution in this field, even between artists working in a similar vein.
Finally, the last major artist discussed is Michelangelo di Campidoglio, another nickname.
Right. His real name was Michel Pace. And just like Maltese and others, his actual biographical details and real name were apparently unknown until relatively recently, the early 2000s. Di Campidoglio just meant he lived near the Capitoline Hill in Rome.
How was his work identified then?
Attribution was helped by linking paintings to engravings made after his works, and then confirmed by other documentary data that emerged. He's now identified as the artist behind a group of works previously known simply as by the master of the Metropolitan Museum's still life.
And what characterizes his style typically?
Objects often arranged on stone steps or ledges, similar in a way to Bonzi or Cellini, perhaps. Sometimes with an undefined background, maybe suggesting sky or water. It's often ambiguous. The lecture mentions he seems to have had a particular fondness for contrasting yellow and green pumpkins or gourds.
And the Hermitage fish still life is mentioned as particularly notable, possibly by him.
Yes, considered one of the absolute finest Italian fish still lifes outside of the Neapolitan school, which was famous for fish paintings. The lecture describes the fish not in terms of perfect realistic texture, like counting every scale, but more as a firework of color, light, and movement, very dynamic.
Now, the lecturer's attribution of that specific fish painting to Campidoglio sounded, well, they called it pure hooliganism. Why?
Yes, that was a great phrase. It's described as unconventional, even jokingly called hooliganism, because the primary stylistic link offered is based on just one observed compositional principle. The specific way a basket recedes into space in the fish painting is seen as similar to how Campidoglio handled spatial recession elsewhere. It's not a huge amount of evidence.
So it's speculative.
Highly speculative, yes. But the argument presented is that this attribution, however bold, places this incredibly high-quality work at the level it deserves, linking it to a known master rather than leaving it anonymous. It's a fantastic illustration of the constant interplay in art history between rigorous visual analysis, informed intuition, stylistic comparison, and the slow, painstaking accumulation of documentary evidence that drives still life study forward.
And this field, Roman still life, is just vast, isn't it? So many artists, so many mysteries still.
Enormously vast. The lecture mentions, hundreds of known artists who painted still lifes, but literally thousands of works surviving that still don't have a firm attribution. And then countless other artists mentioned in historical documents, inventories, biographies, whose works are completely lost to us today. It's a huge area of ongoing research.
This has been an absolutely incredible journey through the complexities of Roman still life. We started with the mysterious beginnings of Caravaggio and his revolutionary basket of fruit, and we've traced its development through major masters like Bonzi, Cellini, Cerquozzi, Mario de' Fiori, Porpora, the carpet masters Maltese and Genazzari, and finally Campidoglio. We've really explored those persistent challenges of attribution, the critical importance of new documentary evidence, and the unique intellectual and dramatic character of Italian still life compared to other European schools.
And as the lecture points out right at the end, there's still so much more we couldn't even get into today. Other significant Roman masters, the huge influence of foreign artists like the Bruegel family working in the city, and of course the entirely separate but related, incredibly rich history of the Neapolitan still life school further south. That's a whole other deep dive.
Definitely. So as you, our listener, think about this deep dive, maybe consider this. Given these constant battles over attribution, the sheer number of undocumented works, and how profoundly the intent behind Italian still life seems to differ from, say, the everyday realism of Dutch painting. What does this story really tell us about how our knowledge in art history is actually built? How much is based on solid documented fact? And how much relies on brilliant, sometimes speculative, but informed interpretation and connoisseurship?
Or perhaps, thinking about Caravaggio's basket again, how does seeing a still life not just as a pretty picture of fruit, but as a carefully constructed idea, maybe one imbued with deep cultural meaning like Vanitas, how does that change your appreciation for a genre often dismissed as merely decorative or secondary?
Exactly. It's a genre full of intellect, drama, beauty, and as we've seen, ongoing discovery. We really hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the hidden depths and fascinating stories within still life painting in Rome.